Most of the time when we think of intelligence testing, we think of your standard IQ test. But did you know that children's drawings of people can also be used to measure intelligence? The Draw a Man test, or Draw a Woman test, which was a later version for girls, was created by Florence Goodenough in 1926 as a way of testing intelligence with nonverbal measures, and updated versions of the test continue to be used today. But who is this Florence Goodenough, and why have I never heard of her before? Well, let's take a little journey back to the good old 19th century. Florence Laura Goodenough was born on August 6, 1886, in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, to a farming family. She was the youngest of 9 children and was homeschooled up through a high school level of education. She eventually received her Bachelor of Pedagogy from the Normal School in Millersville, Pennsylvania in 1908. After completing her degree, she spent about 8 years in various teacher and principal roles before heading to Columbia and earning a Bachelor of Science in 1920 and a Master's in 1921. While at Columbia, she studied under Leda Stetter Hollingsworth. Upon completing her master's degree, she headed across the country and began her doctoral studies at Stanford under Lewis Terman. She was selected as a research assistant for Terman both because of her high IQ and because of a recommendation from Hollingsworth, who was a friend of Terman's thanks to their mutual work in intelligence testing. While studying with Terman, she served first as his chief field psychologist and then as a chief research psychologist, and worked on several of his intelligence projects. In fact, she was even listed as a contributor on his book Genetic Studies of Genius, which was quite an impressive accolade for a graduate student. She completed her PhD at Stanford in 1924. After completing her PhD, Goodenough moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and began working at the Minneapolis Child Guidance Clinic. A year later, in 1925, she was appointed as an assistant professor at the Institute of Child Welfare at the University of Minnesota, now the Institute of Child Development. She later became a full professor in 1931, where she remained for the rest of her career. In 1926, just 1 year after starting her career at the University of Minnesota, Goodenough published her first book, The Measurement of Intelligence by Drawings, Introduction to Draw a Man Test. The Draw a Man test, as mentioned previously, measured nonverbal IQ and was thus able to be used on young children, as compared to Terman's Stanford Binet IQ test, which required language. The Draw a Man test was also quick to administer, it only took about 10 minutes, and had a high reliability rate. As Goodenough described, these drawings were looked at as a window to see mental processes and organization playing off the concept that children draw what they know and not what they see. In 1963, Dale Harris, a former graduate student of Goodenough's, revised the Draw a Man test to add a Draw a Woman test, which became known as the Goodenough-Harris Drawing Test. Goodenough's other major contributions to the field included a revision of the Stanford Binet into the Minnesota preschool scale, which revised the traditional Stanford Binet test for younger children, and her development of event sampling as a methodology. In event sampling, the researcher waits for a certain behavior to occur and then observes the circumstances of the behavior and records its frequency. This method was particularly useful because even parents could use it to track behavior, and it also worked well for infrequent behaviors which may not occur during a typical time sampling method, where short periods of time are chosen in advance and the occurrence of a particular behavior within that time period is measured. Goodenough used the event sampling method in her 1931 study, Anger in Young Children. In 1939, Goodenough and several of her fellow colleagues in intelligence testing, including Terman and Hollingsworth, were part of a great debate sometimes known as the Iowa controversy, which boiled down to a less than friendly argument between those who believed that intelligence was genetic and those that felt that the environment played a major role. In the genetic camp were Goodenough and Terman, while the environmental camp included members of the Iowa Research Station, including Beth Wellman. These debates went on in academia and in publications for several years, and even got dirty when Goodenough argued that Wellman may have falsely interpreted her results. The controversy itself eventually fizzled out, but researchers to this day still argue with the same question of heredity versus environment in the field of intelligence. Goodenough was forced into early retirement from her position at the University of Minnesota in 1947 because she was suffering from a degenerative disease which eventually took both her sight and hearing. Despite this, she still published 3 books after learning Braille: Mental Testing,
created using Powtoon.